right. Welcome everyone to this Policy and Practice seminar hosted by the UCL's School of Public Policy, Department of Political Science. My name is Lauke Poulsen. I'm a professor in the department, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our discussion today, which is focused on the multilateral trade regime and the tensions surrounding it in the context of geopolitical friction. And we're going to focus on the WTO and WTO reform. And to discuss that topic, I can think of no better guest than we have here with us today. We have Ignacio Bercero from the European Commission. Ignacio is director in charge of multilateral affairs and DG Trade. And he is by far one of the world's most experienced trade negotiators and trade experts. He has been deeply involved throughout his career in building the global rules-based order and treaty infrastructure governing global trade since the establishment of the World Trade Organization. And with such a shining career, he is obviously an alum of UCL, and we're happy to have him back. He's a visiting professor in our department as well. And to quiz Ignacio on the topic of today, I'm also delighted to welcome Stephen Adams. Stephen is Senior Director in Global Counsel, which is the world's leading trade consultancy. And he has a background as a senior advisor at multiple levels in Europe, both in the European Commission, European Parliament, and the UK, and previously was an executive director at Goldman Sachs in London. And Stephen is an honorary senior research associate also here in the department. And the format for today is going to be the following. So we're going to have Stephen and Ignacio in conversation over the next 40 minutes or so. And on that basis, we will then open up afterwards to questions both from the floor, but also to our online audience. And to our online audience, if you would like to ask a question, please write it in the Q&A function. And then my colleague who's sitting here in the front row, Fergus Green, will try and screen and select a broad range of questions to be introduced also to the floor here today. And just a final note before I hand over to Stephen to kick us off, that this whole session, including the Q&A, is being recorded, and it'll be posted online on the department's website and on our YouTube channel and our podcast. So if you speak in the event, you will be heard and you will be in the recording. And we will let you all know when the recording is available, and hope that you might share it with friends and colleagues. And with that, I will get out of your way and hand over the floor to Stephen.
Great. Thank you, Lauke. Let me add my welcome to everybody this evening. It's great to see so many of you here. A reflection, no doubt, of the quality of our guests this evening. What Lauke didn't say is that, in fact, for a material chunk of my career as a very young trade policymaker, I actually worked for Ignacio, more or less. And they were, I have to say, it's hard to imagine in many ways a better apprenticeship than watching this man negotiate trade agreements, which was my pleasure and privilege for those key formative early years. And it's always a great pleasure to have the chance to pick Ignacio's brain in public. Having said that, Ignacio, I'm going to be a bit cheeky now, and I'm going to do something I probably shouldn't do, which is I'm going to relay something that we just said in the green room, to the extent that this session has a green room. We were in Lauke's office, and Ignacio spotted a copy of Dean Acheson's Present at the Creation on the shelf. Who here has read or is aware of Dean Acheson's Present at the Creation? Who here knows who Dean Acheson was? Okay, I'm going to look the other way, and you can quickly Google that. Dean Acheson, one of the pivotal figures in the creation of the post-war multilateral order in many respects, recorded his experiences in that formative period in a book called Present at the Creation. And Ignacio joked, I'm going to write a book like that, and I think I'll call it Present at the Destruction. Now, I don't want to spike the ball. I'm sure that Ignacio's view is not quite as apocalyptic as that. But what we're going to spend the next hour exploring is, in some ways, how we should understand the relationship between that moment in time, the late 1940s, the early 1950s, the creation in many respects of many of the core pillars of multilateral governance that we still obviously live under alongside today. And we're going to discuss what it is about today, about this geopolitical moment that might be different from that moment in time. We're going to perhaps range across the landscape between 1947 and the mid-1990s, the signing of the Marrakesh Agreement, the creation of the WTO, and the second big iteration, if you like, of the multilateral trading system. And we're going to explore the question of what it was about those two unique moments in geopolitical time and this moment in geopolitical time, and the ways in which that should condition our thinking about, well, the future of the WTO. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. Ignacio, before I ask you a question, again, just indulge me, one more kind of piece of framing, if you like. I want to just read out two short extracts from H.R. McMaster's National Security Strategy, produced for the Trump administration in December 2017. Does anybody know who H.R. McMaster is? Come on, let's have a few more hands. Yeah, okay, good, much better. Very good. All right, so in 2017, General McMaster produced the Trump administration's national security strategy. And I think in many respects, although it was produced for President Trump, it remains, I think, a fairly accurate description of the way a lot of American policymakers are looking out at this moment in geopolitical time. And I want to read two very short extracts out, and I want us to then see if we can come back to them in our conversation here. Now, the first extract goes like this. Since the 1990s, the United States has displayed a great degree of strategic complacency. We assumed that our military superiority was guaranteed and that democratic peace was inevitable, and we believed that liberal democratic enlargement and inclusion would fundamentally alter the nature of international relations, and that competition would give way to peaceful cooperation. Okay, so that's a first observation, a very harsh judgment on 20 years of US foreign policy, and by implication, 20 years of North Atlantic foreign policy. Okay? The second quote goes like this. This strategy, i.e. the 27 Strategic Review, is guided by principled realism. It's realist because it acknowledges the central role of power in international politics, and it affirms that sovereign states are the best hope for a peaceful world, and it finally clearly defines the United States as national interests. Okay. So we have in there essentially two judgments on an international order that in many respects the United States was pivotal in creating, and they're both, at their core, quite critical, I think, of that order. And in some ways, Ignacio, what I want us to explore is why it is that the United States might, in 2017, have concluded that it had been complacent and that it was necessary to reassert the role of power, international power, in the United States' approach to multilateral governance. Okay. So maybe we can come back to those two thoughts throughout the next hour or so. But I want to start with, in some ways, a more basic question. You were there in 1994, 1995, the signing of the Marrakesh Agreement, completion of the Uruguay Round. In your mind, what's the fundamental difference between that moment in geopolitical time and what it enabled in terms of the WTO rulebook and today?
Well, the fundamental change which has happened over time, and it has been a gradual process, is that when the WTO was created, which was, I would say, an evolution from the GATT system, not a fundamental transformation, but an evolution from the GATT system. There was basically the view that you could conduct your international economic relations on the basis of a rule-based system, and that power dynamics had a role to play which was relatively residual. I mean, there has always been a national security sphere, and one of the issues that has been clear from the very creation of the GATT WTO system is that when you come to national security, you should be able to have a quite unfettered degree of discretion, and you cannot really expect trade rules to limit that discretion. But there was always a sense that this really actually covered a relatively small part of economic interaction. Now, of course, when the WTO was created, China was not yet a member, or Russia. But I would say the whole logic of the system all the way until the moment in 2001 when China joined the WTO was that this basic rule dynamic continued to apply, even if it was actually recognized that there were very significant changes in the nature of the Chinese system vis-à-vis the nature of the market-based economies that were actually members of the WTO. But there was the expectation that China would gradually evolve in a market-based direction. Now, the world in which we are living today shows that on the one hand, there was a little bit of too much optimism when it comes into the evolution of the Chinese economic system. And we can get into a long discussion about that, but it is clear that the role of the state in the economy over the last 10 years has increased rather than diminished, and that therefore the market base for interaction under the WTO system is different when it comes to China today. But in a way, now the issue is broader than that, because what we are seeing now is not just the question about how to actually have coexistence between two different economic systems. You also have the question that you have fundamentally a geopolitical competition. And a geopolitical competition is not based on win-win. It is based on a totally different type of, it's a zero-sum game. So that's a totally different type of dynamic. And sometimes I was actually, when you were actually mentioning what was the reality in 1995 and what it is now, in a way I see that the architecture of the world trading system at the moment of 1995 was a bit like a pyramid. You have a very strong base which was multilateral. You had, of course, those countries which wanted to go beyond the multilateral and could go deeper through regional economic integration, but still at that point in time, there was a relatively limited number of free trade agreements, and you have a relatively small apex, which was the national security sphere. Yeah. Now I think you have a situation in which the national security sphere, it is quite significant. Now, how significant, that I do not know, that I think someone would actually be useful to make a calculation. What part of the economic interaction between the United States and China is currently affected by economic security concerns, and what this implies for the functioning of the global trading system. But it is clearly that it is certainly much, much bigger than it was at the moment of 1995 when the WTO system was created.
Yeah. Do you think it's inevitable that we would have ended up here? Or do you think there's another version of economic history between the mid-90s and now in which the WTO system could have essentially been robust enough to deal with this big change in the global economy?
Well, by the way, I haven't actually come to the conclusion that the WTO system is not robust, because I think that, in a way, what I'm also trying to say is that there's enough flexibility within the WTO system in the way that the WTO was designed with reforms, and that's why I think WTO reform is important, to have a situation in which you can accommodate the present under the same multilateral house of different economic systems, and where you can have a situation in which there is intense competition in a certain economic sphere, which is the one which is linked to security, high technologies, and still have a functioning rule-based system for the rest. And I think that the WTO has inbuilt flexibilities to make that type of coexistence possible. So I would not actually come to the conclusion that this change means that the WTO is no longer relevant.
We're getting ahead of ourselves. We'll come back to the question about the future of the WTO. So let's stay on that point about flexibilities. I mean, as you say, both the GATT and its evolution in the Marrakesh Agreement contains a series of flexibilities that are essentially safety valves, I think, political safety valves for states that give them the comfort essentially to sign up to the constraints in the agreement. And as you say, maybe one way of thinking about where we find ourselves in terms of the WTO rulebook is the question of whether, in fact, we could be making more use of those flexibilities in order to ring-fence and protect the rest of our economic interaction and economic interdependence. But say a little bit more about how feasible you think that is. I mean, I guess my question is that my sense is that the worry among WTO members and GATT contracting parties has always been that if you allow the flexibility door just to open too far, that in fact it will very quickly disable the whole system. Do you agree with that, or do you think how do we strike a balance between the use of flexibilities over here and the rest of our economic interaction over here?
Yeah. No, I think that is clearly one of the big challenges. But let me just also take one step back, because I think there is a tendency to look into the challenges for the global trading system as it was just the question about how to manage the competition between the United States and China. And the global trading system is bigger than the United States and China. And I think that as you look into what could be the proper architecture for global trade, you need to have a little bit of this broader perspective in mind, because it's not going to be just over the next decade, which is going to be a complicated decade with a lot of tensions. It's not just going to be critical from the point of view of how to ensure that geopolitical conflicts do not actually invade the whole of the economic relationship, so that you can have some containment of geopolitical conflicts. But you're also going to have a situation in which you have the transition towards net zero. I mean, after all, this is the big challenge of the next 10 years. And that is also going to be a source of tensions in the global trading system, because countries are going to increasingly be taking actions that have some greater impact on trade, and you need to have an institutional framework to ensure that you also deal with those tensions and that you maintain the cooperation. And we should not forget that, yes, China, India, and emerging economies are very highly integrated in the global economy, but you have also a large number of developing countries which are not very much integrated in the global economy, which is still for them is a big challenge how to develop through trade, and which would not want to be just simply pawns in a geopolitical competition. So I think you need to factor all of those elements when you see what is the type of global trading system that you want to have to ensure that you can somehow limit the risk of a total fragmentation of the global economy. Because, of course, if things go wrong, if you actually get into a pure geopolitical competition dynamic, then you would end up in a totally fragmented world economy. Now, so coming back now, sorry for this long contour, to the question of flexibilities. Now, first, when it comes to actual national security, the GATT from the very beginning has had an exception, Article 21 of the GATT, which has always been interpreted as giving a very, very broad margin of discretion to the country which considers that it's taking an action which is necessary to...
So let me just push you. When you say interpreted to mean, by whom?
Well, to a large extent, I would say until recently it was basically a question of self-discipline. Yeah. Countries were very reluctant to use the national security exception unless there was a genuine national security concern. Now, to a certain extent, this was somehow broken when the Trump administration obviously used the national security exception for something which had nothing to do with national security, which was to protect that steel and aluminium industry. I mean, this was a very clear case, I would say.
So you're talking about the Section 232?
I'm talking about the Section 232, which was clearly not in any way guided by the security concerns. It was simply the idea, okay, it's very rigid to apply the safeguard measures in the WTO. Let's invoke the national security exception, and no one is going to dare to challenge an invocation of the national security exception. Okay, but that's one thing. A totally different thing is the export controls that have been adopted quite recently by the United States on exports of semiconductors and the material to produce semiconductors to China. Now, they are very significant in terms of their economic impact, but I would argue they have a national security rationale, and they fall within the scope of what I would consider to be the scope of the application of Article 21 of the GATT. The other main tool which is being used in order to control the leakage of technologies, if you want, which is investment screening. Again, it is something that is even largely not regulated by the WTO. So there's a lot of margin within the framework of the WTO.
And even if you concluded it could be, then you probably have a GATT 21.
Well, exactly. Even if you concluded, it happens to be an area where you have some GATT commitments that are somehow affected. Still, I would sure that if there was going to be a panel and hopefully an appellate body to look into those issues if a country decided to bring those cases to the WTO. Because
GATS 14.
Yeah. So I think that from my point of view, if it's really an issue about national security, there is plenty of scope within the GATT WTO system to take actions. And of course, the most well, not the most extreme. I mean, what is really extreme is the invasion of Ukraine. But the reaction by many countries to basically apply very broad sanctions that almost affect the near totality of our trade with Russia, we have always argued, and we think totally rightly, that it is covered by Article 21 of GATT. So I don't think that, quite frankly, GATT WTO is as such an obstacle for actions taken by the United States or by China, because I think it's not which are basically based on a national security logic. Now, this being said, the real risk is that if you don't have a system of rules which functions, which operates in the West, increasingly you are going to have a situation in which things are going to be escalating. And that issues which are not really national security issues, which are more normal economic differences, could very easily become political conflict because you don't have a rule-based structure to deal with those more normal, I would say, trade relations. And that's why we think that having, again, a functioning system of solving disputes is really critical, because the WTO, if there was something that was fundamental at the creation, was the decision that was bold at the time to have a system of dispute settlement that would be binding in the sense that it could not be blocked.
Yeah.
Not in the sense that, of course, you lost your sovereignty, because still you can decide to ignore the ruling, and we have done it. The United States has done it. Countries have done it when they feel, okay, we may have lost the case, but on this particular area we cannot comply. But it is not possible for one of the parties to block the procedure of adjudication, which is not the case anymore because of the decision by the Trump administration to basically stop the process of nominations of members of the appellate body. So that, I would say, from our point of view, continues to be the fundamental issue that we need to solve in terms of WTO reform, how to be able to find a way to convince the United States and more broadly that even in the current era of geopolitical conflicts, it makes sense to have a system of rules and a system of adjudication of those rules, knowing that obviously there is going to be a very significant sphere where countries are going to be competing for the technological in the technological sphere, and that competition is not really going to be very much curtailed by the rules.
Yeah. No, so I mean, I want to come back to that question, because in particular I want to read the statement you've just made against the assertion I read out at the start about power and sovereignty. But before we do that, I mean, you described there very elegantly how you might imagine a world essentially of selective decoupling in which we are invoking GATT 21 or GATS 15 as a way of justifying certain kinds of national security-based discrimination or decoupling, which somehow leaves the whole area of economic integration untouched and free of that kind of politicization. Do you actually think that sort of selective decoupling is feasible, or are you not concerned that, as I think WTO members are often concerned, that if, once you take the genie out of the bottle, I mean, a bit like the Trump administration did with its 301 measures, it becomes very difficult then to control the spiral of escalation?
It's going to be a challenge, and that's why I think that the next 10 years are going to be challenging times. But I would argue it is much, much more risky if you are going to have to manage that situation without any institution which is a rule-based institution. Now, it's going to require some degree of self-discipline. There is going to be always the risk of entering into a dynamic of escalation. But I think that dynamic is likely to be, from my point of view, much more risky, much more difficult to manage if you basically have a situation in which you have no functioning multilateral.
Do we still have a rules-based system if we have a system in which the exceptions are proving the rule
all
the time?
I don't, listen, that's what I was asking you. I mean, I don't know where there's any economist that has calculated what proportion of US-China trade would be affected by restrictions. I mean, I would assume that even in the worst case scenario, you are talking about what, 10% of the trade at most? And as I said, we need to see. I mean, this new measures actually adopted by the United States a few weeks ago still are being rolled out. One is to evaluate how far they will go. There have been also, it's clear also, by the way, that it's not just United States. If you actually read the statements coming from the 20th Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, it is clear that China is also going to follow the strategy of ensuring that it maintains sufficient technological independence to avoid the risk of weaponization of trade. In a way, everyone is actually trying to avoid the
Strategic
risk.
autonomy. Sounds familiar.
Yeah, you can also put it that way. But still, I would say it would be in the interest, in my view, both of China and the United States, to somehow have a situation in which they control the risk of escalation, that it still is possible to conduct normal trade relations for a very high proportion of their trade. It is certainly in the interest of the European Union. I don't think that we would actually want to have a free-for-all system in which you go for a broad, across-the-board decoupling. I mean, the decoupling with Russia is challenging, but it's doable. The coupling with China, it is possible, but it will be much more economically costly. And again, at the end of the day, the world is not just Western democracies. You have all the emerging countries in Latin America, in Asia, in Africa, which still want to trade with China, we want to trade with the United States, want to trade with the European Union, which want to attract investment from different sources, and which would not be very satisfied in a situation in which there is no rules of the game anymore which apply.
No, I mean, this is one of, well, maybe irony is the wrong way to put it, but of course a huge majority of the WTO membership still see very much the cost-benefit sort of analysis for them in being in a system of binding rules. Yeah. It's, of course, the fact that the very large players can essentially turn. So two questions then, just before we move on to WTO reform. The first, actually, weirdly, is about Japan. I mean, a lot of the language that we use when we describe, or when US or EU or UK policymakers describe some of our concerns about the direction of travel of the Chinese economy, we would have used about Japan in the 1980s. And many of the solutions that we sometimes talk about, we indeed spoke about with respect to Japan in the 90s. What was different? Why were we able to find a way out of that set of disputes then? And does it have anything to tell us about today?
Well, there is actually an economic difference, but I think much more fundamentally there is a political difference. Geostrategic difference. I mean, Japan was a military ally of the United States. It was not a geopolitical rival of the United States. There was a very tense economic relationship at certain moments in the 80s. There was a sense about Japan Inc., but although it was never the situation of the state having the type of role in the Japanese economy that the state has, the state party has in the Chinese economy. So I would argue both from the economic point of view and more importantly from the geostrategic point of view, it was a very different situation. Although paradoxically, I would say the conflicts between the United States and Japan and also between the United States and the European community, to a certain extent, but more between, was one of the driving factors for the creation of the WTO, because it was actually the feeling that you had a system under the GATT that was too weak institutionally. You had a number of issues that were not really dealt at all by the rules, and if you actually wanted to find a way of managing the system properly, you had to be ready to be bold and to reinforce the institutional basis for trade. Particularly, you had to go to a system of binding dispute settlement, implying also in the contract that the United States would not make use of its unilateral powers when it came for economic gains. So again, I'm not talking about the national security. No, but I think that although it is true that at least in the early days of the Trump administration, when I think the conflict with China was still primarily an economic one, although I don't know exactly what year was the national security. 2017. Yeah. But still, I would say in the early stages of the Trump administration, a lot of the conflict with China had more of an economic rationale behind it. It was not yet a geopolitical conflict rationale as being the primary element, I think, of the U.S. strategy at that point in time.
I mean, the one thing that strikes me about, again, I absolutely take your point about the attractiveness of trying to think that we can selectively decouple certain parts of our integration from the bulk of it. But again, the bit that makes me worry is, in fact, another quote from that national security strategy, in this case, quoting the words of President Trump himself, when he said that economic security is national security. And as a politician, of course, if that's your view, then you're going to take GATT 21 as a very wide-ranging instrument. Okay, so one more question just on the world.
Can I ask you a question, Stephen? Has the Biden administration made this same statement about economic security is national security?
They haven't used those words. I mean, again, I'd be interested in your view.
Because at least I've seen the rationale that has been presented by Jake Sullivan to justify the latest. It is very much a national security guided rationale. It is not a economic security type of rationale. Now, the dividing line is never very clear, but I don't think it's the same rationale that was, for instance, underlined the Section 232 actions.
That's true, but I think we've got to recognize just the extent to which that is contingent on the nature of any individual presidential administration. And of course, in 2024, the minds interpreting these tools could change again. And indeed, I think it's not even. It seems to me that even a Democratic administration could, and is in some ways, by small steps, already finding its way to a policy that in many respects is more radical than Trump's policy in terms of the underlying geostrategic logic that we are on an irreversible track that is leading us towards fundamentally separate spheres of technological development. No. So I want to ask you a question about, unless you want to, sorry.
No, please.
I want to ask you a question about Russia. So we've got this far without even mentioning the single most important geopolitical fact of our current lives. And I guess that in some ways makes a point that when we are talking about the multilateral system, we're talking about something, if it's possible to say this, bigger than, maybe more tectonic than the events of the first half of this year in Russia and Ukraine. But to what extent do you think the events in Russia and Ukraine have moved this question along, or framed it in a new or important way, or told us something about the bigger question of multilateral governance and the way it can survive geopolitical tension?
Yeah. I mean, Russia is not a big player in the multilateral trading system. So I think you can easily see a situation in which you basically have a very broad economic decoupling from Russia. I mean, I think that there we are not really talking about selective decoupling. We are talking about very broad economic decoupling in a situation of war of aggression. But I don't think that this in itself has a fundamental change in the dynamics of the WTO. Now, of course, it is a somewhat complex situation to manage, and having participated in the last ministerial meeting of the WTO, it was something that was delicate, how to handle the ministerial meeting in those circumstances. But I don't think it's actually something that represents an existential threat for the WTO system. Now, it is clear that China is the largest trading partner in the world. Mm-hmm. So you cannot imagine the functioning global trading system without the active engagement both of China and the United States. So somehow the future of the WTO depends on somehow convincing the United States and China that despite the geopolitical competition, it makes sense for them to maintain a sphere of cooperation in the global trading system, which is the space that will be covered by WTO rules. So I think that's the fundamental challenge. And as I said, Russia is a little bit of a relatively not so significant player, I would say.
Yeah, but to what extent would you agree that, or do you think that we should take the policy toolkit that has been deployed in trying to disengage from Russia as indicative of where, say, the US-China relationship might be heading? I mean, you've already made the point that we're talking about a totally different level of integration.
Well, don't forget that the start of this whole reaction to Russia was the invasion of a sovereign country, mm-hmm. A fundamental breach of public international law of the most serious nature, the most egregious nature, and that on these circumstances, the United States, the European Union, and other countries were very, very, very rapidly to respond. Now, that's not, hopefully, the situation that we are at this point in time when it comes to the geopolitical conflict with China. So I don't want to speculate what could happen in certain scenarios that bring me outside my area of expertise. But I mean,
Okay, well, so I'm gonna turn over to questions to you guys in about 5 minutes. Okay, so start formulating your best and most probing questions for Ignacio, all right, in a moment. But before we do that, so let's move on a little bit to the role of the WTO.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've described a world which, in many respects, looks like very difficult soil for the WTO to continue to prosper. Certainly sounds like a WTO that, whatever its future role, isn't the role that was maybe envisaged for it in 1995. Maybe you disagree. But say a little bit about where you think, and because the other thing is that you have said on a number of occasions, you've switched over into the normative voice and you've said we need, which suggests that your view is that whatever you might think might be possible, your view is that what is desirable is that we continue to find a role for this institution. So speak in that, firstly, in that idealistic voice. What in your best case scenario, what kind of WTO do we have looking ahead from MC12 for the next 10 years? What kind of constructive role can it play in this world?
Well, I mean, I would try to give you something which is normative, which at the same time is sufficiently realistic.
Is it sufficiently realistic?
No particular point of actually thinking about an idea, but taking into account the current circumstances, the position of different players in the WTO. Now, in terms of defining a WTO reform agenda, I think you need to have a certain sense about what is doable. Now, first and foremost, I don't think that you can really have a rule-based trading system without an independent system of adjudication that works. That's why the agreement in the last WTO ministerial by everyone, including by the United States, that by 2024, there will be again a functioning dispute settlement system of WTO. It is, I would say, the fundamental challenge ahead of us in terms of WTO reform. Because if you don't have a functioning dispute settlement system, I don't think you can say that you have a rule-based system, and respect for the rules will continue to erode. And in a way, you would legitimate not just actions relating to national security, but all kinds of actions that countries may choose to take to pursue their trade objectives. So I think that is the most fundamental issue. It is something which fundamentally depends about finding the way forward with the United States, because it was the United States that took the decision under the Trump administration to stop the functioning of the appellate body. The good news is that the United States, first, they accepted.
Although we should be clear that the anxiety about the DSM, I mean, Trump accelerated it, but of course it predates him. I mean, it was the Obama administration that started freezing appointments to the DSM. But
it did, although to be very frank, I have serious doubt that Hillary Clinton as a president would have taken the same action. But anyway, that's water under the bridge. What has happened, and it's much more...
But I guess the point is concern at a broad level about DSM. It's not a Trumpy thing.
No, of course. The concerns about the United States, a little bit of a buyer's remorse towards the dispute settlement system. That's something that has been going on for quite some time, was mostly connected to the jurisprudence of the appellate body in the field of trade defense, anti-dumping, etc., etc. That was the main area of concern. Now, what I was trying to say is that this is the most fundamental challenge. And as I said, the element to be cautiously optimistic is that the United States administration has fully agreed on this deadline of 2024, knowing the implications, and they are increasingly engaged in Geneva in having a discussion. Now, for the time being, it's not clear exactly what their expectations are, what type of changes they might want to introduce. I mean, for us, there are two issues which are fundamental and would always need to be there to have a functioning system. You need to have a system which cannot be blocked. That's the negative consensus rule. And you need to have a system where you have the possibility of independent review of the determination made by a first instance panel. Now, within those two parameters, I think that we believe there is a lot of space to discuss, negotiate, and to try to find a way forward. But I would say that is the most fundamental issue, because without functioning dispute settlement, I don't think that you have a rule-based institution anymore. Now, second question is that...
Hang on. So, how is that compatible with a US view that says that the central role in international politics has to be played by the exercise of power, and that sovereign states are ultimately the key to a peaceful world?
Well, first, I'm not sure that that's exactly the way that national security will be formulated by the Biden administration.
Okay, so maybe...
And they may want to introduce a little bit more of nuance to it. They may also be much more concerned about the relationship with allies, because I think something that the United States would need to understand is that for important geopolitical allies like the European Union, like Japan, like Australia, it is fundamental to have a functioning dispute settlement system. Yeah. We cannot actually imagine a situation in which we basically manage our external economic relations purely on the basis of power dynamics. And take the case of Australia. Australia is a country that has been subject to economic coercion from China, let's be clear. They have actually been, one of the tools that they have had to react to that has been bringing a dispute settlement case against China in the WTO. And for Australia, it's very important that there's going to be an external independent adjudication about the behavior of China in such a case. So at least for some of us, it is important still to have a system which is rule-based and which is just not power-based relationship. Now, I somehow, maybe realistically, hope that the Biden administration realizes that precisely because their objective is also to have allies with which to work, they need to be also more considerate towards the position of allies.
But okay, so that's my second, I suppose, challenge. Although I want to agree with you, but I also want to test this. I mean, in the world that we're describing, a world in which we accept a certain element of selective decoupling, isn't the implication of what you're saying a world in which we also accept that we're going to have a jurisprudence of GATT 21? And isn't that a huge problem?
As I said, I mean, they're going to be...
Because you made the point before that one of the things that WTO members have been very careful, or GATT contracting parties have been very careful not to do, is to let the question of judicial interpretation loose on the national security exceptions. But if we're going to have a world in which we delineate quite clearly between acceptable forms of national security exceptions and unacceptable ones, doesn't that imply a role for the DSM in doing that, or for jurisprudence in defining that?
I think that the way that Article 21 has been interpreted has always left a lot of discretion for the country that invokes the exception, unless you have a case of manifest abuse. And if you have a case of manifest abuse, then basically the response is that the country that is being affected by those measures would take retaliation of a commensurate nature. So I'm not sure that at the end of the day, the national security exception as it's currently configured is something that needs in any way to be changed or to be interpreted in order to have, again, a functioning dispute settlement system.
Okay. Okay. Right, so first set of questions essentially around the recreation and the re-implementation of a dispute settlement mechanism. Next positive potential role for the WTO?
Well, the other question is that there is this concern about the WTO negotiating function having been very dysfunctional. Since the WTO was created, only 2 multilateral agreements have been concluded. The trade facilitation agreement was more than 10 years ago, and then earlier this year, the fisheries subsidies agreement, which was a very significant achievement for the WTO, and the first time that you could negotiate in the WTO disciplines that have sustainability as its objective. So a very significant outcome, and also showing that despite the geopolitical challenges, there was still a willingness by WTO members to show that the WTO can deliver. But I think it's clear that there have been a lot of changes in economic interaction since 1995, and that you need to be able to modernize the WTO rule book. And that in order to be able to modernize the WTO rule book, you cannot have a situation in which the only way to do it is through multilateral agreement of all the WTO members. If you don't have a flexibility to accommodate within the WTO open and inclusive multilateral agreements, then the system is going to become basically a system which has no dynamic anymore. So those are issues which I think are going to be quite critical in terms of what is going to happen over the next 2 years. And there are at least 2 agreements which are quite advanced in terms of negotiations in Geneva, which are open multilateral agreements. One agreement is on investment facilitation for development. quite an interesting negotiation because China has been one of the main promoters of that negotiation, and because you have a very active participation by many developing countries, including many African developing countries. The European Union is also very much engaged in this. The United States, for the time being, is an observer. They have not joined in this initiative, and I think it will be, from our point of view, a very important element to introduce for the first time investment type of disciplines in the WTO, not investment protection, something totally different, but quite important in terms of creating the rules that can give the right signals for investors who want to invest, particularly in developing countries. And then you have the negotiations which are more challenging, which are the negotiations on e-commerce. Because, of course, you have the situation where you have this huge area of economic international.
Just explain for this audience the basis of that negotiation, because obviously it's a JSI. It's slightly, I mean, it's a slightly new creature in terms of the negotiating format. So could you just say a little bit about how it works?
Well, I mean, this was an initiative that actually was taken a few years ago in the ministerial of the WTO, where a number of countries that were a bit frustrated about the lack of progress in the WTO multilateral agenda took the decision to start negotiations within the WTO framework, open for participation for any WTO member that wishes to participate. These negotiations happened in Geneva. The WTO Secretariat assists the negotiating process, but they're not formally part of the WTO agenda. Now, the issue which still has not been determined is, once the negotiations are concluded, how are they going to be integrated into the WTO? And that's one of the issues which still would need to be sorted out, because at least some WTO members, notably India and South Africa, have taken very much of a negative position of opposition towards these initiatives. Now, there are legal instruments within the WTO that would allow for such integration. One of the legal instruments is what is called under the WTO agreement Annex 4, which is agreements which are concluded by a subset of WTO members and which only create rights and obligations for those who actually conclude this agreement. There's only one little issue there, that in order for those agreements to be integrated to the WTO, there has to be a consensus decision. So in principle, you could have a situation in which a country which is not participating in the negotiations decides to block the integration of that agreement. Now, that's something to be seen, because at the same time, if you take again the case of investment facilitation for development, it is a negotiation which has, I think, 110 countries. It's a very, very broad participation, which has nothing in that agreement that could be said to in any way to harm the interests of those who decide not to participate. I still think it would be a little bit interesting to see if a country says we oppose the inclusion of this agreement in the WTO. We will cross that bridge when we actually get there, but I think it's going to be a very important test case about whether it's a willingness to accommodate those type of agreements under the institutional structure of the WTO. Because if you have a WTO that doesn't work anymore as a forum for negotiations, it is true that you would have a system that would increasingly be seen to be less relevant. And that's going to be, I think, the other important challenge. And you won't certainly, because I think that you should not be working on the idea that it is either legally binding rules or nothing. I think that kind of position has been always a bit of a limitation of the WTO ethos, this idea this is only about negotiating market access, negotiating legally binding rules, otherwise there is nothing that can be done here. And I think the WTO can play a very, very important role as a forum for deliberation.
Well, and surely one of the implications of what we've just been describing, one of the implications of a world in which WTO members are increasingly concerned about sovereignty and increasingly concerned about freedom of policy space, is a world in which it will become harder and harder to pursue the aim of legally binding agreements. And in fact, the better outcome is potentially sets of codified normative aspirations and ambitions that aren't legally binding. Just one question there. I mean, you made the observation there that China is an active participation in the investment facilitation work. I mean, one of the things in some ways, I suppose, that's been striking about the WTO over the last 5 or 6 years is that for in many ways, China has been a more, I suppose, a more constructive participant in the work of the WTO than the United States. So how do you think this problem looks from, to the extent you feel qualified to say, how do you think this problem looks from Beijing? I mean, what do you think China's aspirations, if we were having this discussion in, you know, in China,
Yeah.
how would we be framing the future of the WTO?
Well, I think,
Idealistically and practically.
I think that China clearly has been probably the biggest beneficiary of the WTO system. So from that point of view, it's not surprising that China has a strong interest in continuing to have a functioning WTO. By the way, China is strongly attached to a binding dispute settlement system, and when actually a number of countries had to develop an ad hoc temporary mechanism to maintain a functioning dispute settlement system, China was among the countries that was ready to participate. So I think that China.
Why do you think that is? Do you not think that's a bit counterintuitive, given China's
Well,
scale, given its absolute commitment to policy autonomy?
Well, let's see. I mean, on the other hand, let's be very clear. The WTO rules have never actually stopped China from taking coercive action. And there have been a number of cases in which China has decided that it had to put pressure on a country, and there it has decided to totally ignore the rules of the WTO and take coercive action. And the big testing issue, which still no one has really fully seen, is to what extent China is now ready to accept that they can no longer claim special and differential treatment under the WTO, because that's a fundamental issue. I mean, we had a very interesting discussion on those issues in the context of the last ministerial meeting. At the end of the day, we could not reach an agreement on the part of the fisheries subsidy agreement that included a special and differential treatment provision. But it was extremely clear it would never have been possible to conclude that article without finding a formula under which China would clearly make very clear and in a legally binding manner that it would not claim a special and differential treatment in the WTO. So that's an issue which is still is not clear to what extent China has come to that point. They say we look at this case by case, etc. So still that, and of course there's another issue which is still. I mean, there's serious concerns about the role of the state in the economy, the role of state-owned enterprises, the distortion that is actually generated in the system, and it's not clear to what extent China will be ready to negotiate stronger disciplines on subsidies. Now, I have not come yet to this question of subsidies because it's one of the issues which I think inevitably you would need to tackle at some point in time in the WTO. Subsidies is a big issue, and both agricultural and industrial subsidies, I think down the line, at some point in time, you would need to find a way to modernize the rules. I think, however, this is an issue that probably is going to take longer than some of the other issues which I have mentioned. It is part of the WTO reform agenda, but it's certainly one of the more challenging parts of the WTO.
Well, and also, if we look at, say, US behavior in the last couple of weeks and its behavior on electric vehicles, we're dealing with a situation in which it's not just China that is perhaps unhappy with the SCM framework on subsidization. Let's open it up to people, please. Yes. Let's have some questions. Please here at the back, and we're going to go side to side just because we've only got one microphone. So we'll start over here, we'll start over here, and then we'll go over here. Nice and loud, and let's make sure that it's got a question mark at the end.
Yeah, thanks for the very interesting discussion. My name is Michael Owadek. I'm a lecturer in EU politics here. So my question is also going to be partly EU politics related. So sort of still related to what you were talking about, but a little bit in a different direction. So you have massive experience, obviously, acting on behalf of the EU in PTA negotiations with different countries, including the most high-profile ones like TTIP. And I'm just wondering, given sort of maybe there is some bit of fatigue about concluding these types of agreements, and the EU kind of behemoth and its ability to conclude these agreements seems to be a little slow. So I'm wondering to what extent you think the EU is losing credibility, if at all, internationally, when it comes to its ability to conclude agreements. And I know, and obviously there is the underlying institutional issue where the Commission is pushing for these agreements to require less ratification steps by making them not mixed agreements, and the pushback that you have from the member states on the other side. So I'm just wondering on your kind of views on that.
Great. Yeah. is that kind of believing you're asking a representative of the European Commission if the EU is losing credibility in terms of its ability to conclude PTAs. Great. Can we just make sure that the mic just migrates its way over to this side, ready for the next question? Ignacio.
Well, I mean, this is a totally different topic to the one that we have been discussing. Now, the EU first has probably the broadest network of PTAs in the world. So from that point of view, we have been doing quite nicely in terms of concluding the PTAs. This being said, it is clear there has been a challenging time in which actually there has not been ratification of free trade agreements in the European Union. My sense is that we are somehow turning that page. I mean, maybe also because of the geopolitical situation, because of the need to diversify our exports from Russia as a consequence of the invasion of Ukraine. There's an increasing support among the member states and in the European Parliament for the conclusion of a trade agreement, provided that certain conditions are met, and one of these very important conditions is sustainability, because I mean, you would only be able to conclude trade agreements if these have a strong sustainability component attached to it. But we are having now a situation in which we have just concluded negotiations with New Zealand. We are about to conclude negotiations with Chile. We have also very close to getting to the final phase of our negotiations with Mexico. And all of these agreements, I would really expect that they would go through a process of ratification in the Council and in the European Parliament. And of course, you would know that since the very difficult situation that we had for the ratification of the agreement with Canada, of CETA, all the agreements that have been concluded since then have been EU-only agreements. That is to say, agreements which can enter into force on the basis of a positive support in the Council and in the European Parliament. Now, so I would think that our credibility is hopefully going to be maintained and enhanced. As I said, those are three negotiations which are now quite close to the phase in which they would actually have to go to the ratification procedure, and where I would not really expect difficulty in getting these agreements through Council and European Parliament. Now, you have, of course, some other negotiations which are still ongoing. Australia, again, with the new Australian government, the political dynamic behind this negotiation has very, very much improved, also because of the position of the new Australian government about climate, which was different to that of the previous one. Let's see what happens this weekend in Brazil, because that might also have some important implications for the possibility of moving forward with Mercosur. And we also embark separately, but we also embark in the adventure of trying to negotiate a trade agreement with India. So I think there's a lot of activities being undertaken at this point in time. So I think my impression is that in the new geopolitical context, there's a new, stronger rationale for this type of trade agreements, because it's not only that there are value in terms of generating the new market access opportunities, it is also their value as partnerships for cooperation. And I think increasingly, because we are going to be living in a much more unstable environment, it is going to be important to have countries that you think you can rely upon. So I think, in my view, the geopolitical rationale for these PTAs is probably going to increase. At least in Europe. I know that in the United States the picture is a little bit a different one.
Yes, I mean, when you think about it, the single biggest and most important, and in some ways easiest way that you can diverge from the MFN principle in the WTO rulebook is to negotiate a preferential trade agreement. So if you want to create geostrategic corridors, then that's how to do it. We had a question up here, and hands up, catch my eye, please.
Yes, I would like to ask you about the China-EU relationship in the context of Mr. Scholz's visit to China next week. He popped into Paris yesterday to take Mr. Macron with him, or Mr. Macron wanted to go with him to reciprocate the previous visit of Chinese president in Paris. My question is as follows. Don't you think that we already have a second Cold War? How on earth the Western countries would risk their supply chain and reinvigorate the trade with China?
Well, the trade and economic relationship with China is a challenging one. And I think that we certainly have concerns about Chinese economic policy. We have concerns about the lack of a level playing field. We have concerns about distortion of competition. And at the same, it is clear that you also need to be careful to avoid excessive dependencies from China in certain critical products. This being said, it is certainly not European policy to engage, not to engage economically with China. It is not European policy to enter into a Cold War dynamic with China. So there is certainly an interest to continue to have economic engagement, while at the same time being very clear that we will defend our values and that we will be ready to react strongly in instances of economic coercion. I mean, as you know, China, for instance, took coercive measures vis-à-vis one European member state, and we launched a case in the WTO, and we are in the process of also developing tools in the European Union that would allow us to react more effectively in cases of economic coercion. So I'm not going to comment on the visit of Mr. Scholz to China or his conversations with Mr. Macron. That's really not for me to say, but I mean the overall positioning of the European Union vis-à-vis China, it is certainly one that includes reasonable economic engagement, concerns about the level playing field, readiness to act when it comes to issues concerning the human rights, forced labor, etc., etc.
But I'm going to ask you a question on that. In a world in which market actors ultimately design and implement supply chains, how does the EU avoid critical dependencies?
Well, I mean, it's clear that first you need to actually analyze where it is that you actually have a critical dependency. And we have been doing a lot of work within the European Union to do an analysis about what are those products for which we are highly dependent from a very limited number of suppliers. And it's not many products, but about 50% of those dependencies relate to China. Mm-hmm. And then you need to see, is this a dependency that we should be concerned? Is this something which can actually generate a vulnerability from the security point of view, which at some point in time could expose us to risk? And then on that basis to see how you can actually look into alternative suppliers, and that's why developing partnerships is important. By the way, actually most of the areas where there are dependencies from China in the European Union, it tends to be the same products from which there are also dependencies in the United States. By the way, there are also areas where China is dependent on the European Union. It's by no means a one-sided type of dependency. There's actually a high degree of asymmetry in the degree of mutual dependencies.
Yeah. Okay. Another question at the back here, and then here in the middle. Actually, let's take both at the same time, if that's okay. You're relatively close.
Yes, so I had a question. It was more about the democratic nature of the system. So when you look at the global international system, whether it's the IMF or the World Bank or even the WTO, there's this rule that if a country has a great economic weight in the system, then it contributes more into the system, and then it has more power and influence. How can we reconcile that mechanism with one that would have more democratic legitimacy in the sense of, like, if a country has more of a population, then it would have more power and influence? And also more a question related to the European Union. There have been divisions relating to the successful pursuit of sanctions pressure on Russia. And we've seen a notable divergence, notably with Hungary, and especially in Italy, which is, with the rise of a far-right government, is becoming hesitant or in that sense. So how do you think we can reconcile those divisions between, like, member states that are more dependent on Russian gas and states like the United Kingdom, for example, or states like France that are less dependent on natural gas? Thank you.
Okay. Well, let's take both of those, and if we can get the microphone here in the middle. Okay, so.
Well, I mean, actually, if you define democracy about all countries having the same vote in decision making, the WTO is totally democratic, because every member of the WTO has the same votes, and everything has to be decided by consensus. So from that point of view, I would say the WTO, contrary to the IMF or the World Bank, has a very democratic institutional structure. Now, part of the problem is that sometimes democracy does not really produce much of a result. And that's why the real difficulty in the WTO is how to try to be sure that you don't have a situation in which the consensus route paralyzes the organization. And I don't think it's actually very democratic either to have a situation in which a group of countries under the WTO want to develop closer economic interaction, they want to develop additional disciplines, they want to do it in a manner which is inclusive, and they don't want, and the rules that they are developing are not harming the interests of any other member of the WTO, and that the country says, sorry, rule of consensus, you cannot do it, I will block you from doing that. I don't think that is democratic either, so I think that's why for the WTO to have a viability, to be able to have a dynamic, it is really important to find a way to integrate within this common multilateral architecture the possibility of open plurilateral agreements. And I would argue that's fully democratic. Actually, what is not very democratic is to have paralysis because of the abuse, I would say, of the rule of consensus. Right. Sorry, on the second question concerning the sanctions against Russia, but the new Italian government, in principle, has indicated continuity in terms of the policies relating to sanctions against Russia. So I don't really see that at this point in time we have sense that there's going to be any different positioning. Yes, it's true that it has been sometimes a bit challenging to get consensus in the Council, which is needed normally for sanctions to be adopted. But you know, it takes a little bit of time sometimes, but at the end of the day, it works.
Great. Question in the middle here, please.
As an experienced negotiator, what advice would you give to aspiring negotiators to negotiate effectively in a consensus setting?
Well, my advice to any negotiator, it is really important that you have two things very clear. One is what are your objectives, what it is that you want to get from the negotiation, and B, what is the objectives of your counterpart. Because at the end of the day, there cannot be an agreement unless you find a way of reaching the common understanding. Now, of course, if you are talking about a multilateral negotiation, that's probably more challenging than a bilateral negotiation. When I was young in the days of the GATT negotiations, you had a quite good negotiating dynamic within the GATT, although it was a multilateral institution. It is much more difficult in the WTO because the WTO has become a very divided organization with many different views about what it is that you want to get from the organization. And if you don't have a commonality of purpose, it's very difficult to negotiate anything. This being said, you know, multilateral negotiations work. I mean, we had these difficult negotiations in the WTO earlier this year when we were basically trying to conclude this multilateral agreement on fisheries subsidies, a very important topic. And you have to be negotiating 2 days with 2 nights to finally find something in which everyone realized that, okay, it is not ideal, it is something on which I have had to make certain sacrifices, but still failure to conclude would be politically too costly. And that's why it was important that the sustainability purpose of the negotiation, because that's what makes it politically difficult to explain that you have not been able to conclude an agreement. So my advice is be clear about what it is that you want to achieve, and if you really want to be involved in multilateral negotiations, be patient.
Be patient. Yeah, bring a change of shirt. That would be my, probably 2 changes of shirt. That's my advice. One more question, maybe, please. Yeah, here in the middle, and the 2, and then one at the back here. That's great.
So, as you said, the heavyweights of the World Trade Organization, so the US, China, and the European Union, you said that the WTO was like a democracy and that it worked very to have consensus and everything, but still their decisions and their opinions are more important to some extent than other countries. And so my question is, regions that are still developing, so South America, Africa, and Asia, are there things that they are not happy about with these like multilateral agreements in which China and the US have way more weight? And are there certain countries or certain regions that are losers in respect to those multilateral trade agreements? And yeah.
Well, the way that the negotiating dynamics work in the WTO, it is certainly not a system in which basically the United States, China, and the EU agreed on something, and then you have an agreement. It is a much, much more complicated dynamic on that, and actually it's relatively rare that the starting point is an agreement between the United States, the European Union, and China. I mean, take these negotiations on the fisheries subsidies. The critical dynamic at the final phase of the negotiations was, to a certain extent, a conflict between India and the ACP countries, because India was not satisfied with the provisions in the agreement on special and differential treatment. It made very clear that they thought that they were actually unfair because they would actually, from their point of view, favor the ACP countries. And as a result of that, there have to be a number of adjustments of the agreement. And the basic final negotiation in the last night of the fisheries negotiation was to try to find a solution that would accommodate some concerns of the ACP countries. So normally you always have within Geneva different coalitions of countries, the African group, the Cairns group, which is a coalition of agricultural exporters, including many countries in Latin America. So the dynamic of the negotiation is by no means one in which things are dominated by the United States, the European Union, and China, and then the others follow. It is a much, much more complicated dynamic from that. And certainly African countries play a very important role in the WTO. I mean, obviously some countries like South Africa particularly play a leading role. And I mean, to give you another example, one of the difficult negotiations concerning the last ministerial meeting were the negotiations relating to the waiver on intellectual property rights. In those cases, the critical negotiations were between the European Union, South Africa, and India and United States. China did not participate, and China was not very happy because of that of the outcome. And the final issue that had to be found to solve the issue was to find a provision concerning China not benefiting from the waiver. So that shows you that the negotiating dynamics are always very fluid in Geneva, and it is certainly not a system which is basically United States and the European Union to reach an agreement and then everyone follows. I mean,
well, also, I mean, we described in some ways the national security exceptions as part of the kind of safety valve that enabled the agreement of the GATT. If you want to think about the Uruguay round, it's the flexibilities for developing countries in many respects, that both the SDT structure but also the use of the enabling clause, that was one of the big ways of unlocking a wider agreement. So, yeah, I agree with that. So we had a question up here at the back, please.
Yeah, my question just follows up from that. It's just about the dispute settlement mechanism. So in terms of that, similarly, how have you seen in the past kind of, I guess, 20 years or so, that change in terms of developing countries filing cases against developed? My research is from the 1995 case Costa Rica filed against the United States. So I found that particular case interesting. They won the case. What has been the trend since kind of then in terms of these cases, and what have you seen?
Well, I mean, actually, I don't have the latest data, but I mean, there has been quite a significant number of cases of developing countries bringing cases against the United States, bringing cases against the European Union, developing countries bringing cases against developing countries. It is true that some of the smaller developing countries have not really participated very much in the system, mostly because it's normally challenging for a small administrative developing country to take the biggest step of bringing the case in WTO. Although it's not so much the cost of a case, because what you actually have in the WTO, you have an institution called the Advisory Center for WTO Law that provides very, very cheap legal assistance for developing countries that want to take a case. But if you actually look into the history of disputes in the WTO, you will see that the developing countries have made a very significant use of the system. I said not only vis-a-vis the majors, but also between themselves.
Great. Okay, right, well, so we have a altercation in the front row. Great. It only really remains for me to say, well, thank you obviously to the audience, but particularly a big thank you, as always, to Ignacio. Ignacio, that was a masterclass, as always, so thank you very much. We said at the beginning that we would try not to allow this to be, the session to become too depressing. But it's nevertheless, of course, the case that Ignacio has brilliantly set out, in many ways, just how challenging the next decade is going to be for the system that in many ways he and his colleagues helped create 25 years ago. And a big part of that is, of course, the fact that whether you agree with the 2017 national security strategy that the last 25 years have been a case of complacency on the part of the US, it is nevertheless clearly a very different world. And the world that saw the creation of the multilateral trading system that we currently regard, in its most modern iteration, isn't the world we live in, and that means it's going to be a very interesting 5 or 10 years ahead. So thank you for coming out tonight. As always, we appreciate it, and thanks again, please.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, Ignacio. The only remaining comment from us is, first of all, thank you very much for coming. We will have another seminar next week on the US midterm elections. The plan was to do that online because there was a planned rail strike, a tube strike. That has now been postponed, so it's still a little bit unclear whether we're going to keep that online or we will have another session in a hybrid format. So please stay tuned on Twitter and our social media, and if you're on an emailing list, then we'll give you updates on that shortly. But again, thank you very much for this evening. This was very enlightening, and welcome back to UCL.